I have run the numbers on that morning more times than I have run any figure in my life, and the figure that comes back is always 40. 40 is not a lie. I want to be clear about that before I tell you anything else, because everything I tell you afterward will make it sound like a lie, and it was not. 40 was the honest ceiling. 40 was the truth as my people understood truth, arrived at without error, checked twice, and then a third time by a second ledger keeper, who did not know my work so that her arithmetic could not lean on mine. 40 living bodies was the most the lifter at Cradle 6 could raise off the plateau at SciFi Landing, and drive clear of Charon's gravity well before the anvil came down. I would stake my name on that figure now, years later and a long way from that sky, and my name is not a small thing to a meridd. And the human raised 71. I was flight master of the cradle. That was my station and my rank, and in a way my people would understand better than yours my creed. A flight master keeps the ledger of lift. Mass in, thrust out, the wells grip below, the margin between them thin as a wire. We are a careful people. Our histories are ledgers. Our scripture, if you want to call it that, is a running account of what a thing costs and what it can bear, and I had kept that account faithfully for 30 of your years before the moon broke. Asa was the moon. It had hung over Charon since anyone kept a record of Charon, a pale gray coin the colony farmers used to set their planting by. It was not a large moon. It was, my geologists told me afterward, a fractured moon, cracked through some ancient stress that had held for an age and then in the way of old cracks stopped holding. It came apart over a single night. In the morning the coin was gone, and there were pieces where the coin had been, tumbling in a slow, bright ring, and the largest of them, a shard my instruments named by its mass alone, and which the colonists christened the anvil, had fallen out of the ring and into the long curve that would bring it down on the northern reach of the continent in 9 days. 9 days is a very short time to weigh a world. I will not describe the panic to you because I did not see much of it. Cradle 6 was a lift station on a plateau above SciFi Landing, a flat scarp of pale stone with the cradle bolted to it and the town below in the river bend, and I spent those 9 days in the flight house at the top of the cradle with my ledgers and my crew, running the only sum that mattered. How many? How many can we raise? There was one lifter left on Charon that could reach orbit and hold there, a heavy meridd hauler we called the Draywell, and every other ship that could have helped had already gone up in the first 3 days carrying the ones who could pay and the ones who were quick, and the Draywell was scheduled to make her single climb on the morning of the 9th day. And the sum I ran, over and over, in the daylight pouring through the flighthouse ports, came back 40. Understand what 40 meant. SciFi Landing was a small town by your measures and a large one by ours, and even after the early ships there were 400 souls still on the plateau on the 9th morning, and more coming up the road from the low farms with what they could carry on their backs, and the sum came back 40. The Draywell could hold more than 40 bodies. She could hold 300 if you packed them like grain, but holding is not lifting. Lifting is thrust against mass against the well, and the well does not care how many hearts are beating in the hold. The well cares only for the total, and the total the Draywell could raise and drive to orbit before the anvil struck was 40 living bodies in the ship that carried them and not 1 gram more. I had checked it 3 times. The second ledger keeper on Surith had checked it once alone and once beside me. 40. There was no 41st. The 41st would fall back with the town. I want you to sit with that arithmetic the way I sat with it, in the bright daylight, with the glare of the falling shard already visible in the northern sky as a hard silver point that had not been there a week before, because the story I am telling you is a story about that arithmetic, and about a man who looked at it and did not argue with a single figure in it and still made it wrong. The man was the loadmaster. His name was Das, Halden Das, though no one called him Halden. He was a human, one of the small human contingent that had come to Charon a decade before to work the deep cargo trade, and he had been the loadmaster of the SciFi Landing cradle for most of that decade, which meant that where I kept the ledger of lift, he kept the ship. He was the one who knew where every gram of the Draywell lived. If I said the ship massed such and such, it was because Das had told me what she carried, plate by plate and tank by tank, and I trusted his account the way I trusted my own, which for a meridd is not a small trust either. I had known him 10 years, and I could not have told you a single thing about his inner life. He was a broad, plain, weathered man, gray coming into a beard he kept short, and he moved through the cradle at the same unhurried pace whether the ship was empty or an hour from launch. He did not raise his voice. In 10 years I had never once seen him hurry, and I had never once seen him wrong about the mass of a thing. He would heft a crate, set it down, and give me a figure, and when we weighed it the figure was right to within a fraction, and after the first year I stopped weighing his figures. That is as high a compliment as one of my people can pay a man. I stopped checking his arithmetic. On the 9th morning he came up to the flight house at the top of the cradle just after first light, and the light was very bright, because Karen's sun rose clean and hard over that plateau, and the flight house had ports on every side, and the anvil's point hung in the north like a nail driven into the blue. Das stood in the doorway with the light behind him and asked me for the number. I gave him the number, 40. He did not say anything for a moment. He came in and stood at the port that faced the cradle apron, where the draywell sat on her cradle clamps with her hold open and her ramp down, and below the ramp, on the pale stone of the apron in the bright morning, the people of Seth Landing stood in a line that went back off the plateau and down the road toward the town, 400 of them and more, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have already understood something and are waiting only to be told it aloud. 40, Das said, not a question. He was reading the line below the way he read a manifest, and I understood, watching him, that he was not counting the 40. He was counting the rest. I told him what he already knew. I told him the ship could hold more but could not lift more. I told him about the well and the thrust and the mass, and I told him about the margin, which I had already cut to nothing, because a careful flight master keeps a margin, and I had spent mine down to 0 in the hope of a 41st, and there had been no 41st. I told him the arithmetic was honest. I remember I used that word, honest, because it mattered to me that he understand I had not stopped short out of caution or fear. I had run the sum to the bone. 40 was the bone. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his way, and when I was finished, he stood at the port a while longer looking down at the line, and then he turned and looked at me, and he said the thing I have carried with me ever since. He said, "Then we throw everything that isn't a person over the side." I did not understand him. I want to be honest about that too. I have told this account many times, and in the telling it is easy to make myself the one who saw at once what he meant and grasped the greatness of it. I did not. I heard the words, and I heard a man refusing arithmetic, which is a thing frightened people do, and I felt something close to pity, because I had liked him for 10 years and I did not want to watch him break against a number. I told him, as gently as my language allows, that the mass of the passengers was not the problem. 40 passengers was already the problem. The ship herself was most of the mass. He could throw a man's coat over the side and it would buy him nothing. And Das looked at me, and this is the part I cannot make you feel, though I have tried for years to find the words. Das looked at me with no heat in it at all, the same flat, patient look he gave a mismeasured crate, and he said, "I'm not talking about coats." Then he went down to the ship. I followed him. I tell myself now that I followed him because it was my duty to keep the ledger of the lift, and that is true. But the truth under the truth is that I followed him because I did not understand, and a meridd who does not understand a number cannot rest. I went down the cradle stair into the bright noise of the apron, and I found Das standing at the foot of the draywell's ramp with his crew around him, 4 humans and 2 of my own people who worked the cargo, and he was talking to them in the low, even voice he always used, and what he was saying was this. He was telling them to gut the ship. Not the cargo. There was no cargo. We had thrown the cargo out days before in the first frantic recalculation, and it had bought us 4 passengers and no more. Das was not talking about cargo. He was standing at the ramp with a marking stylus in his hand, and he was walking his crew through the draywell plate by plate, the way he had memorized her over 10 years, and he was telling them what came out. The passenger seats came out, all of them, the whole cradle and harness assembly that let 40 bodies ride a hard climb in something like safety, torn from the deck and carried down the ramp and set on the apron, because a seat is mass, and a seat is not a person. The interior decking came out. The bulkhead panels that made the hold a room instead of a cage came out. The water reserve came out, all of it. The great belly tank that would have kept 40 people alive for the 3-day climb to the transfer station. Because water is mass, heavy mass, the heaviest single thing aboard after the drive, and a man can go 3 days without water if he must. And the ones who would die of thirst at the station were fewer than the ones who would die on the plateau. And Das had done that sum in his head standing at the ramp, and it was correct. I watched them carry the water tank out. It took 11 of them and a lifting sled, and it left a wet dark stain on the apron stone where the last of it drained, bright in the sun. And I stood there with my ledger and I began, without meaning to weigh what they were doing. Because that is what I am. I could not help it. The seats came out and I logged their mass. The decking came out and I logged it. The water came out and I logged it. And as I logged it, a figure began to move in my ledger that had not moved in 9 days, and the figure was the number of bodies the draywell could lift, and it went up. Not by much at first. Seats and panels are mass, but they are not the drive and they are not the frame. The number went from 40 to 43, and I told Das so, standing at the ramp with my ledger, and he did not stop and he did not smile. He said, "Keep counting," and he sent his crew deeper into the ship. What they took out next I would not have believed a man would take out. They took out the inner hull. Not the pressure hull is the frame. It is the ship. You cannot fly without it. But the inner lining, the double wall that a meridd hauler carries, because a meridd hauler is built by careful people who do not like the idea of a single wall between a crew and the dark. Das had his people strip the inner lining out of the draywell in long curved sheets and carry them down the ramp and stack them on the apron. And each sheet was mass, real mass, and the number in my ledger moved again. And I understood, standing there in the bright morning with the anvil, a hard point in the north, that Das had known about that inner lining for 10 years. He had carried its mass in his head the whole time, the way he carried everything, a number waiting for the day it would matter, and this was the day, and he spent it. 43, 47, 51. The line on the apron had begun to understand what was happening. I do not know how they knew. Perhaps they saw the number of empty seats being carried out and understood that empty seats meant full seats somewhere. But a change went through the line, a straightening, a lifting of heads, and some of them began to come forward and help. They carried the stripped panels away from the ramp so the crew would not have to. A farmer took one end of a hull sheet that 4 of my cargo workers were struggling with and put it on his shoulder and walked it off the apron alone. Nobody organized this. It happened the way water finds the low ground. The town emptied the ship, and the ship grew lighter, and the number climbed. 54, 58. And here is where I have to tell you about the archive, because the archive is the part of this that I did not throw over the side, and the part I have carried the longest. The draywell was a meridd hauler, and a meridd hauler carries the ledger of her voyage. Not in the small way your ships log a trip, but in the full meridd way, a physical archive, a vault of record cores in the deep of the ship that holds the accounting of everything the ship has ever carried and everywhere she has ever been. To you it is data, and data has no mass. To us the record is a thing, a made thing, cores of a dense crystal we grow slowly and inscribe once and never erase. And the archive of a hauler as old as the draywell was a wall of them, and that wall had mass. And I knew its mass because I was a flight master and knew the mass of everything on my cradle, and its mass was not small. I had not thought of the archive. I want to be honest. In 9 days of running the sum to the bone, I had never once considered throwing the archive over the side, because to a meridd the archive is not cargo. The archive is the ship's soul, if you want the nearest word your language has. It is what makes a meridd ship a meridd thing and not merely a hull. You do not weigh a soul against the well. You simply carry it, the way you carry the frame, because a ship without her record is not a ship we would fly. Das weighed it. He came to me at the ramp. The number in my ledger was at 58 then, and stuck, because the seats and the water and the lining were gone, and there was nothing left in the ship that was not frame or drive or archive, and he asked me what the archive masked. He did not ask whether it could come out. He asked what it masked in the flat, patient voice, and I understood that he had memorized every plate of that ship over 10 years except the one thing he had never been allowed to touch, and now he was asking. I did not want to tell him. I remember that clearly, the not wanting, a thing I had not felt in 9 days of hard arithmetic. I told him what the archive was. I told him it was the ship's whole record, every voyage, every ledger, the accounting of an age. I told him it was not cargo. And Das listened, the way he always listened, and then he asked me again what it masked, because he had heard everything I said and none of it had changed the only fact he needed, which was the mass. And I stood there in the bright light with the anvil in the north and the line of the living on the apron, and I gave him the number. He did the sum in his head. I watched him do it. He looked at the number I had given him for the archive, and he looked at the line, and he did the division, mass over the per body figure, and he found the answer. And the answer was that the archive of the Draywell, the record of an age of my people's voyaging, a thing we do not weigh against the well, was worth 13 human beings. 13, he said. And then he said the other thing I have carried. And this one he said quietly, only to me, because I think he understood that this one was mine to bear and not the town's. He said, "It's your ship. I won't touch it unless you tell me to." I stood on that apron a long time. The crew had stopped, waiting. The line had stopped. The anvil was a point in the north that was no longer only a point. It had begun in the last hour to show a shape, a hard, bright grain in the sky, and the shadow it would cast was still hours off, but everyone on the plateau could feel the clock in it now. Das stood beside me with his stylus in his hand and did not press me. He had given me the number, and the number was 13, and he would not carry the number out of the ship unless the flight master of Cradle 6 told him to, because it was my ship and my people's soul, and he was, at the bottom of everything, a loadmaster who did not touch what was not his to touch. I told him to take it out. I will not pretend to you that it was a hard sum, once I let myself run it, because it was not. 13 living beings against a wall of record cores is not a hard sum. It is the easiest sum in the universe, once you are willing to put both things on the same scale, and the whole of what I learned that morning, the whole of it, is that my people had never been willing to put both things on the same scale, and the human had never for one instant imagined a scale with only one thing on it. That was the difference. That was the entire difference between 40 and 71. We had weighed everything against the well except the things we had decided were beyond weighing, and Das weighed those too and set them down and walked another person up the ramp. They took the archive out. My own cargo workers did it, the 2 meridd on Das's crew, because I would not ask the humans to carry it and Das did not offer. He understood that much without being told. They brought the record cores up out of the deep of the ship in the gray carrying frames we use for them, wall by wall, and they carried them down the ramp into the bright morning and set them on the apron stone, and I logged their mass as it left the ship the way I had logged everything, and the number in my ledger, which had been stuck at 58, came unstuck and moved. 61, 64, 68. And the line came forward. As each seat's worth of mass left the ship, Das's crew walked a person up the ramp and into the stripped hold, where there were no seats now and no lining and no water, only the bare frame and the deck and the harness points where the seats had been, and the people took hold of the harness points with their hands and their arms and stood in the hold pressed together, because there was no other way to ride a hard climb, and they did it without complaint. A woman went up with a child on her back lashed to her with a strip of cloth, and Das stopped her at the ramp and weighed the child by eye and said nothing and let her by, because a child on a back is less mass than a full-grown body and the sum still held. An old man went up. 2 old men. A girl carrying a smaller girl. The line moved and the number climbed, and I stood at the foot of the ramp and logged every gram of it. And somewhere in there, without my noticing the exact moment, I stopped keeping the ledger of the lift and started keeping the ledger of the saved. 6870. The anvil had a shadow now. It fell across the far northern edge of the plateau, a cold line moving toward us over the pale stone at the pace of a walking man, and the light where the shadow had not yet reached was brighter than ever, the hard, clean light of that world's sun, and the two of them together, the bright and the coming dark, made the apron a place I have never been able to describe. Das did not look at the sky. He looked at the ship and at the line and at his stylus, and he worked the last of it. There was almost nothing left to take out. The ship was down to her frame and her drive, and the bare deck her passengers stood on. He walked the deck once more, the last walk, and he found, I did not see what he found, but the number moved one final time. He found some last mass, some plate or fitting or tool locker that even I did not know the ship carried, and he had it taken out, and it bought the 71st. The 71st was a boy, perhaps 12 of your years. He had come up the road from the low farms alone, at the very end, and he had reached the plateau after the line had already understood there was no room, and he had stood at the back of it not asking for anything. And when the number came unstuck one final time, Das's crew brought him forward and walked him up the ramp, and he was the last, because there was nothing left in the ship to throw over the side. The frame could not go. The drive could not go. Das himself had already run that sum too, I know he had, because he ran every sum, and the frame and the drive were the floor under 71 lives, and there was no 72nd. They sealed the ramp. Das did it himself from inside because he went up with them. A loadmaster rides his ship, and someone had to hold the mass in balance on the climb, and that was his sum too and his to carry. Before the ramp came up, he looked at me one last time across the bright apron, and I want to tell you that some great thing passed between us, but nothing did. He gave me the same flat, patient look he had given me for 10 years, the look he gave a crate whose mass he already knew, and he said the only thing he said to me at the end, which was, "You'll want to move off the plateau, Veith." Practical to the last. Then the ramp came up and I moved off the plateau. I watched the Draywell climb from the shelter of the scarp, with the archive of my people stacked on the apron behind me and the empty seats, and the coiled hull lining, and the drained water tank, all of it left on the stone to be struck flat in a few hours' time. She went up slow. A stripped hull with 71 aboard and no margin left is a slow, hard climb, and I stood there in the last of the bright light with the shadow of the anvil coming across the plateau, and I ran the sum one more time, the honest sum, the one that came back 40, and I watched a ship that could not carry 41 carry 71 off the face of that world and up through the bright air until she was a point, and then not even a point, and then gone, ahead of the dark. She reached the transfer station. Not all of the 71 reached it well. 3 days with no water in a stripped hold is its own hard sum, and there were some who came close to the edge of it, but the station had water and the station had room, and every one of the 71 who climbed off the plateau climbed down at the station alive. Das last of all, walking down the ramp of a gutted ship at the same unhurried pace, as though he had done nothing that morning but load a routine cargo, which in his own accounting I think is exactly what he believed he had done. The anvil came down on the northern reach a little after the Draywell cleared the well. I did not see it. I was in the deep shelter under the scarp by then, with the archive of my people around me in its gray frames, having decided in the last hour that if the record was worth 13 lives, it was worth carrying into the dark with me and bringing out again after, and it survived, and I have it still. The plateau did not survive. Ceph Landing did not survive. Cradle 6 is a scar under a new gray plane now, And the seats and the lining and the water tank are somewhere in the deep of that plane, thrown over the side of a ship to buy the difference between 40 and 71. I have kept the ledger of that morning ever since. I have run the lift 10,000 times in the years since on better instruments than I had that day, with the mass of every plate of the dray well known to me now to a finer grain than Das himself carried, and the sum comes back 40. It is not a lie. It has never been a lie. 40 is the honest ceiling of that ship against that well on that morning, and I would stake my name on it now, and my name is not a small thing. And every time the sum comes back 40, I am wrong. I know I am wrong, because I stood on that apron and logged the mass out of the ship gram by gram and watched the number climb, and I know that 71 living beings climbed off Charon on a ship that could carry 40, and I know how it was done. It was done by a man who looked at an honest number and did not argue with a single figure in it, and who understood a thing my whole careful people had never understood in an age of keeping ledgers, that the ceiling was never the mass of the ship. The ceiling was the mass of everything we had decided was too sacred to weigh. He weighed all of it. The seats, the walls, the water, the record of an age. He put every one of them on the same scale as a single living body, and every time the body was heavier, and the other thing went over the side. I am a careful people's careful son, and I will tell you the truest thing I know, which I learned on a bright plateau under a falling sky with the honest number in my hand. There is no ceiling. There is only the last thing you were unwilling to throw over the side. We called ours the ship, and the water and the soul of our people, and we were wrong about all of them, and the human called his nothing at all, and he was right, and he raised 71. 40 is the honest number. I have run it 10,000 times. I hope I never stop being wrong.